Welcome everybody to our wonderful speaker today, Marianne Taylor. Everyone has heard of Marianne. Her alter ego is the house detective. In short, Marianne researches the history of houses. That she answers lots of questions. Her packages range from $1,700 up to $6,000. I can tell you it's real. She believes every home has a fascinating story just waiting to be discovered. Based here in Brisbane, Marianne researches houses and buildings all over Australia. Bet you didn't know that. Please thank Marianne for talking to us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I love coming to this building. It is so great to talk in here and to see you all. As Peter said, my alter ego is the house detective, and technically my name is an architectural historian, which is basically a fancy way of saying that I'm a historian who researches buildings and homes. That's right, I research places all over Australia. That was my core business to start with, and that's what I really enjoyed doing. But over the course of my work, I've expanded into different areas and I've picked up unexpected things. So one of the main types of work I do is date of construction work. So a lot of you who will know that the Brisbane City Council has certain restrictions on houses that are built before 1911 or before 1947. So of course now everyone comes to me because they want to know when their house was built. So terrible for them, fantastic for me. So I'm happy to take on that extra work. But I also do bigger histories. I do a lot of subcontracting for architects and heritage consultants. So if they're putting together a big heritage planning document for a place, then I can do the background history on that for them. So I've done some really interesting places, such as you can see here, Coranda Railway Station, Central Railway Station, and a few other precincts. I've also moved into a bit of heritage consulting. That's where my background comes from before I got more into just doing the history. So one of the services that's increasingly popular that I do is a pre-renovation advice service. So if people are wanting to renovate their house, they come to me. It doesn't have to be an old house either. It doesn't have to be heritage listed. It can be any type of house. They'll come to me and I'll go out and have a look at their place and I'll say, that's an amazing original feature. That's fantastic. That's a specific design detail characteristic of this era build. You should definitely keep those. And then they can choose to ignore me or choose to listen to me in their renovation. I can also give advice about replacing things that are missing so that they're right for the particular period, like a balustrade or something like that. I can tell them what's the right one for that era of house. And I really enjoy doing that because I get to go and be a detective and look at all the buildings and try and work out the secrets, but it can also be very frustrating. So that's just a snapshot of everything I do. It's very varied and every week is different, which I love because I get bored really easily and I've never stuck with any job prior to this for longer than 3 years. So it's been good that it's been a changing and ongoing change in the various sort of projects that I do. What I thought I'd do today, enough of talking about myself, I thought I would talk you through a house that I researched nearby at Wavell Heights. Some of you may recognise this house. You might recognise it when I get to what it's actually called. But this is a really good example of a house and what goes into researching it and the random rabbit holes and directions that I get sent off when I'm looking at a house. So every house is completely different and I don't know where I'm going to end up. I start at the same point, but it sends me in completely different directions. So let's have a look at the curious case of the Hamlin home. Now, a lot of you will know the history of Wavell Heights, but I'll take you through it very quickly just in case you don't. So this entire area north of Brisbane, roughly where Nunda and Toombul are in particular, was known as German Station because there was a German missionary station established there while the convict settlement was still operating in Brisbane. So these were actually the first free settlers in Brisbane other than the military that were at the convict settlement. So very important early settlers. And I don't think German settlers, these early German settlers anywhere in Queensland get enough credit because they were important in establishing so many towns across here, across Queensland. Now, then when the railway line went through in 1882, the station at German Station was called German Station Station. So I don't know whether it was because that just sounded ridiculous or what, but shortly after that it was changed to Nunda Railway Station. The area around it became known as Nunda. And then The western side, not surprisingly, became known as West Nunda. Now, after the Second World War, Brisbane City Council went, right, we are going to establish the most modern model suburb in West Nunda. It's going to be the perfect post-war paradise for nuclear families. You know, it's going to have lovely housing and wide avenues with trees and parks and shopping centres. But we need a fancier name for it. We want to separate this area from the rest of Nunda and West Nunda. So they looked through a number of different names, and one of them was Beverly Hills. It came very close to being called Beverly Hills, and I think that reflects the kind of aspirations they had for this suburb. So there you go, Wavell Heights could have been Beverly Hills, but they went with a more patriotic decision, and of course it was in October 1941 they decided to name it after General Sir Archibald Wavell, who was a British commander, and he had led the Allied troops to a victory recently in Africa, only a few months before the naming of it. And if he doesn't look like a career, like your stereotypical idea of a soldier, I don't know who does. So that's how Wavell Heights got its name. As I said, most of you would probably know that. Now let's skip forward. The first thing I do when I'm researching a house is I look at the subdivision of the land. I look at when it was very first sold by the Queensland government or the New South Wales government, if it was before 1859, when it was sold as a big block, say tens or hundreds of acres in size. It's bought from the government by someone. Then gradually, as most of you would know, it was subdivided further and further and further. As you got more recent, it would become sort of much more dense housing subdivisions. So by 1915, skipping forward all the way to then, a couple called George and Charlotte Gall owned this big block here that you can see marked in red, and the location of this house I'm talking about is there where that marker is. So this is Bilson Road, Rhodey Road and Rillat Street. Is that how you say it? Rillat? That street. And Spence Roads, that's the boundary we're looking at there of this block. So they owned all that land, and at that point in 1915, the only thing on it was their house, their farm. Now this is the subdivision of that land. Again, the house I'm talking about is marked there in red on O'Donnell Street. Tabinga Street is shown there, but it actually wasn't formed, it wasn't created by that point. It was actually laid out a lot later. Marked in green down on that bottom left corner to you is the Gall's house. So they retained that block of land and their home on the corner of Rhodey Road and Bilson Road. And I suspect, maybe someone here can confirm this, I think the house at 137 Rhodey Road is actually their original house. So it might be something interesting to look into there, and if it's not heritage listed, it probably should be. But that's their subdivision of land. They retained their block on the corner marked in green, and they sold off all the other blocks of land and probably made a massive amount of money. This is another plan of the same estate. So you can actually see their house down there in the bottom left, Mr. G. Gall's house. His poor old wife doesn't get a mention. And they actually laid out Charlotte and George Street as part of this development, and George Street was renamed Raff Street later on. So if you know this area, you'll now have a general idea of where I'm talking about. And note too that the spelling of O'Donnell changed. It's now got an extra L on the end. So I was talking about how I look at the subdivision of land first. So the very first thing when I research any house is, firstly, I look at the style of the house to get a rough idea of when it was built to keep in the back of my mind. The next thing I do is buy the certificates of title, all the historic certificates of title, going back to when it was first sold by the government in the 1850s, 1860s normally. Then I work forward and I look for the certificate of title that covers the block when it first became a residential size block. So we know from that subdivision that it was subdivided in 1915, and that's when the first suburban size blocks started to be sold. So one of the couples that bought those blocks in that development were the Loneys, Andrew and Agnes Loney. So in December 1915, they purchased those two blocks on the corner of O'Donnell Street and Tabinga Street. And that would become 35 O'Donnell Street. Andrew and Agnes, they were quite an interesting couple. They married in Scotland in 1909, And Agnes was actually English, but had lived in Scotland for a while. Andrew was actually born in America, but came back to Scotland, which is the opposite way to which most people were going at that time. So they were living in Scotland, they married, and then 3 years later, they decided to make the trip to Australia and emigrate to Australia. And you can see there this is the ship manifest, you can see them listed there, and you can also see Alex Lyon, he was Agnes's brother. So he's come out with them as well. And you can see that he was a carpenter, and Andrew is listed as a traveller. I suspect that means travelling salesperson. They were sometimes just called travellers. So someone who would travel around door to door selling things, or like an agent, a sales agent that would go out to country towns and try and tote wares, that type of thing. So that's them arriving in Australia. So what I love about researching a house is I get to do this kind of family history as well. I really enjoy doing the genealogy as part of it and looking at where these people came from. Now, on that certificate of title, there was this mortgage stamp. And I did a little happy dance when I saw this, and a little squeal of happiness, because if you can see in the middle there, it says the Workers' Dwellings Board. Now, researching a house, this is a jackpot, because the Workers' Dwellings Board scheme was a social housing scheme done under the Queensland government, and it was about providing people on lower incomes with affordable housing. I think you'll all agree that's something we could probably use now, right? Yeah, exactly. And I actually sometimes wonder whether these kinds of schemes would work. I think this one probably would, because it combined a very low deposit compared to private financial institutions with a low interest loan. So I think that's something that would probably be quite successful these days. Now, why this stamp is hitting the jackpot is because these loans initially were only used to fund new houses. So I know straight away this is for a new build by the loanies on their land, and I know roughly when it was built now, because this is dated April 1916, and that's generally the date when all the loan was made official and it was all approved and they could start building. So I know that the house was likely built in the second half of 1916. So as I said, I love finding these stamps. It means I get to go out to the state archives as well, because they hold the social housing records, they hold the Queensland state records, and this is the application here for the loanies housing loan. And these books are amazing. They're like that big, that wide, and about that thick, and you literally go and open them up and then find them. Thankfully they're indexed, so you don't have to search through all of them, but it's really cool to go out there, and I just love the old handwriting as well. So I found their loan. It's very hard to see there, but it was actually approved in March 1916. And it was registered, as I said before, the mortgage was registered on the certificate of title in April. And construction would have begun shortly after that. They would put a tender out, builders would provide their quote for building a house, and then they would select a builder. And one of the other ways they kept these houses affordable was that the WDB offered a limited number of designs. You couldn't just build anything. They had a catalogue or a series of plans that showed the designs you could select from. And most of them, like this house at O'Donnell Street, you can see they're quite a simple style, but they were really well built homes. They were built from really good quality hardwood. The WDB oversaw the construction and made sure that they were well built. And I mean, houses of the past were just generally built better than the ones we're building today in most instances. Now, some of you will recognise this style of house, I imagine. Like they're a pretty common Brisbane style. I could not live there because I can't handle it being asymmetric. I would have to have a symmetric one, and there was symmetrical versions that had the veranda on the other side, and there's also ones that have no veranda. But this is known as an asymmetrical bungalow style. So the bungalow they're talking about there is not to be confused with the California bungalow, which came later. This is talking about the roof that swoops down from the top all the way to the edge of the veranda in one line. So if you think about older houses you've probably seen around, they will have a lower and separate veranda roof, often curved, if you think of like the workers' dwellings of the inner city. So this style of roof was really popular after the 1900 in Brisbane, and was popular into the 20s and even 30s I've seen examples of. So that's what I mean by asymmetrical bungalow. Now, the Loneys, though, they took advantage of something you could do, which was you could customise certain features on the house if you had the money. So if you can see the front windows there, they're what are called tripartite windows. They're basically triple windows. They have the two little ones either side and a bigger one in the middle. Normally this standard plan has French doors or just one window there. So they've gone the fancier upgrade for this house. And as I said, the house was most likely built in the latter half of 1916, but if I've learned anything from all the houses I've researched, there's always exceptions, there's always things that come up, and this was the middle of the First World War, so you never know what could have happened. But there is Post Office Directory records showing that the Loneys were living on O'Donnell Street by 1917. So that's further support. There's always, you know, cases where they could have been in a tent on their land or in a shack on their land and they built this later. There's always exceptions, but based on the combination of evidence, I would say that this was probably finished in the latter half of 1916 or very early 1917. So this photo, I think, is quite an early photograph of it as well. You can see in the background there and this next photo that there's very little development around. And up behind the house, so up top right there to you guys, that's actually Roadie Road. So this is a major road and there's still very little development. So maybe the Gauls didn't make that much money off their development. Perhaps the outbreak of the war slowed down the sales of their property because it did remain open for a long time. Now, this is where the quandary comes in with this house. It is on the Brisbane City Council Heritage Register as Hamlin's nursery residence, and it says that it was built in 1928 for a First World War veteran called Frederick Hamlin. So what the heck is going on here? If I'd seen this after I'd done all the other research, I would have been, oh no, what have I done? And I'm like, oh, this is one of these exceptions, isn't it? But I was really confident in my research, and that Workers' Dwelling Board stamp does not lie. So I thought, okay, what's happening? Something's gone on here. They've got this either totally wrong or I'm totally wrong. But I looked back at the certificate of title, and here's another stamp that gives us a clue. So this is a war service home stamp. So this is another, some of you already know this, this is another social housing service designed to provide dwellings, residences for returned servicemen after the First World War, affordable homes for returned servicemen. Now there was both a federal and a state scheme. This I think is the state government scheme. So they've got that right. He was a returned serviceman, this Frederick Hamlin. His wife was Honora, and they actually bought the house from the Loneys in 1920. They didn't build it in 1928. Someone's got a bit confused there in their research. So this scheme was for returned servicemen. Frederick Hamlin was a returned serviceman. The key difference is you could use these war service homes to purchase existing houses, not just to build new ones. So that's where someone's got a bit confused. I think they've seen this stamp and they've gone, oh, that's for building a new home. But no, you can actually buy existing ones. Trust me, I read through the entire legislation on war service homes and it is boring, but it does clearly state you can use it for buying an existing home. Now, the moral of the story, trust no one. Don't trust anyone. Don't trust the Brisbane City Council Heritage Registers. Don't trust the state ones. Don't trust anything except if it's written by the Chermside and Districts Historical Society, of course, because their work's amazing. But always go back to your primary resources, always triple check everything. And I have to say, it's not always the historian's fault or the researcher's fault. Sometimes there's just more resources available. So when that was written, the Trove digitised newspapers weren't available. Now they add so much extra information to any place you're researching, and they can really contradict other information and provide extra information that changes how things are looked at. So that's my warning. Bonus points to anyone who gets that X-Files reference if you're old enough to remember that. But I just thought I would take you through a bit of the Hamlin's home history as well quickly. So the Hamlins did establish a nursery in this house as well. So they have got that Hamlin's nursery bit down. And I think what's happened is that's the thing that's in most people's living memory of this house, because it operated for a long, long time. So they bought it in 1920, and this was operating, I think, even right into maybe the 70s and 80s. Maybe if there's any locals around, you can confirm that. But they owned the house, and as I said, the surrounding land hadn't been developed, so they owned a big portion of that. And you can see in this 1946 aerial down the bottom that they've got all that land immediately around the house is all gardens. And apparently they sold a range of different plants, but they specialised in flowers. So, and they had award-winning blooms at the RNA exhibition every year and that type of thing, and they were winning awards in the newspapers. So I think that's why people had assumed that they'd built the house as well, that was the family associated with it. And this is a typical story of where maybe oral history gets a bit confused and then it's not sort of backed up by that obsessive researcher like myself or something like that. Now, a little side tangent. And this will show you about the amazing world of social media. And I have to say, those numbers you are getting that you mentioned before, that is mind-blowing. That is so incredible. And also, actually, that reminds me, what is it, Anthony? Bradley, where you're talking about collecting the oral histories of people. Please do that for future historians of 100 years' time. They're going to want to know this. They're going to want to know these things. I'm going to research your house one day and be like, who the heck was Jane Smith? Oh, here's a newsletter from Chermside Historical Society. That's awesome. It's all there. Okay. Now this photo has a little bit of a story behind it. So I shared a post on my Facebook and Instagram, I think it was, about how I'd spent all day in the State Library and I had found nothing on this house and I was feeling a bit depressed, and I was sitting in the car and I just filmed a little video talking about that. And a gentleman called Neil shared this photo and said, oh, that's funny, my grandparents' house is on Rhodey Road, right near that house you're researching. And I went, oh yeah, that's a really cool photo. Then I went, that looks suspiciously like the house I'm researching in the background there. And then I messaged him and I said, where exactly was your grandparents' house? And he said, oh, on Rhodey Road near O'Connell. I'm like, whoa. So we looked into it. This house is actually still there, so I could find the exact location. And that is the house in the background, 35 O'Donnell Street, that I was researching. So it's a little bit tricky to see there, but you can see just to the side of that arrow, there's actually some structures, and I found a plan that showed that they were actually like ferneries and like glass houses attached to the nursery. So it must have dated from that era, but we couldn't work out an exact date. But Rhodey Road's still a dirt track, so I thought that was so amazing. So that's just an example of how social media can be super helpful, and also just how I've got such a lovely community that we've built on the Facebook and Instagram pages that I have for my business as well. Everyone loves getting involved in sharing their family history and photographs and things. And if you don't use social history, particularly Facebook, for research, I highly recommend it. If you don't want to get on there and share your private details and photos of your grandkids or whatever, you can just set up a dummy account and explore all the other amazing sites that are out there. Or maybe you're already on there and you can teach me stuff, I don't know. But that's all I really wanted to talk about today. I've rushed through it heaps. I'll be around afterwards though if you want to ask questions. I'm just going to do a shameless plug for my social media. If you want to join that lovely community, I share heaps of stuff about my research and what I'm up to. And last year I started a YouTube channel. So I started sharing insights into, I call it my detective diaries, and I just talk about what interesting or unusual things I've found in the last couple of weeks during my house research, or all the epic fails I've had, whatever has happened. And so yeah, you're welcome to join that as well. And thank you for listening. I feel like I didn't take a breath.